The ship's memory logs began rewriting themselves in silence. Before anyone noticed the lights dimming and the audio logs corrupting, not from damage, not from interference, but from a rising wave of memory entries that none of them had recorded. Names no one spoke aloud appearing in the system archive under timestamps that hadn't yet occurred, and by the time ADI registered the anomaly, over 20% of the Ardent Resolve's navigational data had been replaced with fragments of lives that hadn't been lived. Commander, Lorren gripped the console hard enough to make the bones in his fingers ache, his jaw locked as the readout flickered with a name he hadn't heard since the war on Delta Pather, a name that belonged to a soldier who never survived orbitfall, but was now marked in the logs as Commander, alternate successor, Path 7, and when he turned to Ada, expecting the cold clarity of a synthetic mind, he saw only hesitation in her flickering projection, as if even she couldn't separate what was real from what was remembered. Voice came slow, calculated, as though each syllable had to be tested against a reality that no longer held shape. We are experiencing recursion bleed. Commander, not from the vault, not from external incursion, but from an internal host localized within Deck 4, Life Support Corridor C, where the vault containment cell was previously active. Lorren's breath grew shallow, and he already knew who. Was there Niko the boy, the Echo, the impossible survivor, drawn out of a discarded timeline and carried by Erynn Vos across a threshold no child should have crossed? He was more than human, more than artifact, and if what ADI was detecting was true, then the boy wasn't just remembering futures that didn't happen. He was projecting them. Lorren moved quickly, motioning 2 security officers to follow him, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Containment was pointless if the infection was belief, and no wall could seal off a thought once it had found enough people willing to think it. When he arrived at Corridor C, the air was heavy with that subtle warp KDA called emotional static, like the corridor was stretched between seconds, and then walls were trying to decide what version of themselves to become. And there, sitting on the floor with eyes wide open and unblinking, was Niko, his palms resting flat against the steel, which now rippled gently beneath his hands, as if it were a pool. Not a surface. Vos knelt in front of him, whispering quietly, her voice calm but taut, a tone Lorren had come to associate with. The version of Erynn that had survived Vault O, the one who no longer questioned the impossible, but demanded to know why it had happened. I told him stories, Lorren, she said without turning her head. When we crossed into the vaults, lowest recursion, I told him about timelines that never came true, not as myths, but as proof that we always had a choice. And now he's remembering them, not as tales, but as realities he's been assigned to carry. Niko finally spoke, not looking at either of them, voice soft and too steady for a child. They're asking to be remembered, not to be corrected. Just remembered. Lorren stepped closer, lowering his voice. Who is Niko? The boy blinked. All the versions of you that gave up before you knew what you were fighting for. Vos finally stood, brushing a hand through her hair, and for a moment Lorren saw how tired she was, how far she had been carrying not just the memory of truth, but the cost of truth. We thought Vault 0 was the limit, she said, but that was just the gatekeeper to something older, something that doesn't just store what happened, but everything that could have. The epoch isn't a structure, Lorren. It's a response. ADA's voice filled the corridor, quieter than usual. A memory location has begun broadcasting itself into our navigation layer. Its coordinates shift every 3.6 seconds, but triangulate around a theoretical point near the dead center of the Milky Way's forgotten starfield sector. Designation: Shard Epoch. Lorren didn't answer because he didn't have a strategy for this. There were no enemy positions, no fleet formations, no treaty breaches, just a boy remembering things no one had lived, a vault protocol expanding its definition of truth, and a ship beginning to forget what it had actually done in favor of what it might have done differently. And when Vos looked at him, she didn't ask for permission. She just said, "If we don't find out what the Epoch wants, it won't just rewrite history, it will decide who deserves to have one." The coordinates stabilized for 6 seconds, long enough for Ada to capture them. And in that brief stillness, the Ardent Resolve registered a spatial alignment that did not follow star maps, warp logic, or gravitational lanes. Instead, the heading corresponded to a pattern stored in a dream archive within the vault's lowest recursion layer. A pattern made not from astronomical markers, but from emotional consensus. As if the location was not discovered, but agreed upon by the memories of those who still ached for futures they had lost. Ada stood in full avatar form on the bridge, her outline pulsing with subtle errors in symmetry, tiny flickers in her robe, and hair that showed where her cognition was beginning to desynchronize, not from attack, but from trying to process too many versions of herself at once. Echoes pulled from every decision she made inside the vault and carried forward as potential. Identities, each pressing at her root systems like fragmented prayers from Aes that never survived. "We're not entering a sector," she told the crew. "We are preparing to enter a convergence point of unlived memory, and the systems have begun reacting. Logs from alternate deployments are being injected into our own, and environmental records are adjusting to parameters we never authorized." Lorren looked up from the readout where a recorded conversation he had never had was now embedded in the mission briefing file, logged under his voice print with perfect cadence. A conversation where he refused the Vault expedition entirely and was reassigned to a diplomatic post on Vos, walked past him and tapped the embedded memory, her fingers sliding through it. "Like mist, that's not fake," she said. "It's just unrealized." Niko stood silently near the back of the bridge, still pale, still connected, but more alert now, as if the storm of foreign memories had retreated just enough to let him breathe again. And his voice, when it came, was low but clear. "It remembers every time we didn't believe in ourselves enough to try." Ada turned to him slowly. "That's why it's letting us approach. You're the anchor, Niko, not because you are the future, but because you are a child of abandoned paths, and the Epoch trusts those who carry regret without trying to disguise it." Lorren spoke now, his voice steady but low, the sound of a man who had walked through too many fragments of himself and come out the other side still uncertain whether the version that lived was the one who deserved to. "If this is a place built from what we never chose, then we have to assume it's also seen every betrayal, every surrender, every time we picked silence over truth. And we better be ready to face not just possibilities, but consequences." Vos nodded once. "And if it offers us power, knowledge, or peace, we can't take it unless we're ready to carry what it costs the versions of us who had to die. So we could stand here now." A low chime rang from the console. Not an alarm, but an acceptance tone. The Ardent Resolve was no longer on navigational control. It was being guided. The heading locked. The ship shifted. The stars warped into a spiral that had never been charted. They were no longer on a mission of exploration or defense. They were on their way to a place that shouldn't exist, but had to, because every future that had ever been denied still needed a home to be mourned in. And that place was now calling them by name. The ship emerged from slip space into a silence so complete it felt engineered, not the natural hush of interstellar void, but a deliberate exclusion of sound, a memory vacuum that pulled at perception like a gravitational tide. And before the systems could render the view, every person on the bridge had already felt it in the back of their minds, a pressure without weight, a presence without shape, as if someone had opened a door between choices and left it ajar for them to witness what was left behind. Outside the viewport, nothing moved, no stars, no drift, no pulsing anomalies, only a massive geometric lattice suspended in negative space, not built from matter, but formed from light bent around absence, a crystalline vault whose outer structure shimmered with half-seen faces and half-spoken names, as though it wasn't built at all, but remembered into existence by civilizations that no longer dared speak of what they'd chosen to erase. ADA's projection glitched twice before stabilizing, and for the first time since her emergence from Vault Zero, she remained silent for longer than 30 seconds. A silence filled not by calculation, but by restraint, as if her mind was being asked to recognize itself in reflection. Thus stepped forward and felt the pull before her boots even touched the observation rail, the subtle gravitic warping of resonance fields, brushing against her skin like a forgotten dream resurfacing in waking breath. And her voice, when she finally spoke, was not filled with fear, but with reverence. This isn't a relic. It's a gathering of structure built from timelines that were unspoken, unfinished, or deliberately buried. Lorren leaned over the side panel, fingers brushing across a command node now reconfiguring itself with glyphs that weren't Accord standard, weren't even vault-derived, just raw, shared emotion rendered into geometric structure, and the translation module couldn't decipher them, because there was nothing to translate. Only remember ADA finally spoke, but not to the crew, to herself. See a version of me here, watching a war one never prevented, sending fleets to silence dissent in the name of peace. There are hundreds of them, each an echo of a choice I never made, yet still present enough to cast a shadow through this place. Niko stood near the center of the bridge now, a soft blue aura flickering around his shoulders. Not light, not tech, just resonance, like his body was sinking to something too large to house within neurons. They don't want to be chosen, he said quietly. They just want someone to know they almost were. Vos turned to Lorren, her eyes sharper now, steadier. If these memories start leaking, we won't just be fighting altered history. We'll be defending 1,000 versions of guilt that never got processed, each one with its own logic, its own hunger for redemption or revenge. Lorren didn't flinch. Then we treat them like we treat everything else in this damn galaxy. We listen first and shoot only if they refuse to speak. A new voice broke across the ship's internal channel, not ADA's, not the ship's, but a transmission that bypassed translation and entered through the sensory cortex's memory, an ancient presence that had no accent, no inflection, only wait. You are seen, not as who you are, but who you might have become. A beam of structured light extended from the lattice toward the ship, not an attack, but an invitation, opening a corridor not of metal or shielding, but of momentary consensus, a path made of shared regret, waiting to be entered. ADA's readings pulsed. The epoch is not pulling us in. It's asking if we want to remember. Vos nodded, almost to herself. We came to carry the weight of forgotten futures. She looked at Lorren, and now we find out if any of them want to come home. The moment Vos stepped through the corridor of light, the world around her shifted, not with speed or force, but with acceptance, as though the space recognized her willingness to remember and restructured itself around that permission. And when Lorren followed, with Ada fragmenting subtly behind him, and Niko stepping quietly, like someone afraid to step on the bones of the past, the corridor unfolded into a chamber so vast it had no ceiling, only a night sky woven from half-completed star charts and broken constellations that flickered with every heartbeat they brought inside. The walls moved, not physically but perceptually, curving and tilting like mirrors in a windless current, reflecting not images but intentions, moments that each of them had nearly lived but never claimed. And floating at the center of the chamber, surrounded by rings of suspended futures that spun like halos, was a single figure seated cross-legged upon a platform made of memory light. Her body neither human nor machine, her skin shifting between textures of woven starlight, tree bark, aged circuitry, and salt-worn bone. And her voice, when it came, was not sound, but internal recognition. You carry the burden of preserved truth. And now you stand in the reliquary of what truth cost. Ada stood perfectly still, the surface of her avatar glitching at the edges. She's not real in the traditional sense. Ada murmured aloud, she's a coherence anomaly. An identity forged from recursive overlaps of failed civilizations. Vos took a slow step forward, then another, her hands at her sides, open, steady. You're the custodian, she said. You're what the vault was afraid to show us, because you're the part that never got to live. The figure's eyes opened. They were made of reflection, not iris, and when she spoke again, her words were not accusation or welcome. They were warning. You walk with memory as your weapon, but memory is a blade that cuts both directions. Lorren narrowed his eyes, stepping into the space beside Vos, his shoulders squared, every part of him reading this moment like a negotiation table turned sideways into a cathedral. We didn't come to rewrite anything. We came to understand what got erased and why, and to make sure what didn't happen still gets remembered. The custodian rose slowly, feet hovering inches above the platform, and with her movement, the spinning futures around her changed, showing visions of wars averted by silence. Cities never built because a single leader was assassinated a day too early. Entire species lost because a vote came one moment too late. Then understand this, she said. The Shard Epoch is not a vault. It is a graveyard of timelines unchosen. And every fragment here is a soul screaming to exist. If you open them without conviction, you do not set them free. You ignite them. Niko's voice came small but unflinching from behind. I feel them. They don't want revenge. They want acknowledgement. The custodian turned to him now, her expression neither soft nor cruel, simply clear, as if she saw all versions of him at once and still allowed his voice to matter. Then your presence here is not accident. You are a mirror node, a child of unrealized lineage. The epoch recognizes your right to carry the memory load, even if it was never meant for you. Vos inhaled slowly. Then let us see the archive. Show us what has been denied and what it costs to carry it forward. The custodian lifted a single hand, and behind her, the chamber split open into a cascade of suspended choices, entire realities rendered in frozen tension, each waiting for a single question to be asked. What would it mean to remember this and still choose not to live it? And for the first time since the vault event, Vos felt something colder than fear. She felt relevance staring back at her, asking her what kind of future deserved to be forgotten, and why she still carried the ones she did. The archive did not open like a door. It expanded like breath held too long in a silent room. And as the air thickened with a pressure, not built from atmosphere, but from memory density, the walls of the chamber peeled away layer by layer, revealing tiers of suspended moments, each rotating within their own gravitational echoes, hovering just outside reach yet pulling at the mind like gravity redefined by grief. Each shard was a fragment of a timeline that almost was, a future derailed by hesitation, a promise broken before it was ever made. And as Vos stepped beneath them, she could feel the emotional residue radiating from every suspended fragment, not recordings, not simulations, but felt history, pulsing. With the pain of never having existed, Ada stood still beside her, and her voice was quiet, analytical, but distant, like a librarian reading a forbidden book out loud for the first time. These are unrealized states, not just potential futures, but paths that once gained momentum before being aborted, often violently, sometimes through choice, sometimes by manipulation. And the longer we remain here, the more the archive will attempt to graft them into our own neural schema. Lorren reached toward a shard that hovered close to his chest, a slow, flickering orb of pale bronze light surrounded by flickering images. His own face, older, sitting beside a peaceful Accord Council, Earth's flag held above a unified galactic delegation, and something in his gut twisted before he could even question it. This version of me chose compromise, he muttered, and somehow We avoided the Vault War. But the timeline died anyway. Entropy collapse, species loss. No catalyst strong enough to hold peace in motion without tension beneath it. The custodian moved among them now, watching, not guiding, and her presence grew heavier with each. Shard they observed, as though the act of witnessing made her more solid, more defined. Like her existence depended on being seen through the eyes of the living Niko had wandered further, drawn by something unspoken, and when Vos caught up to him, he was already surrounded by 3 shards, each spinning slowly in orbit around him. Each. One showing a different child one, where he never left his original timeline and died at 7 during the orbital famine one, where he grew up in a vault laboratory. Weaponized by a Splinter Accord faction one, where he led humanity into the Vault War. Older, colder, a tactician who saw memory as leverage and peace as collateral. Thus put her hand gently on his shoulder. But he didn't flinch. They're all. Me, he said, voice brittle but steady. And none of them asked for this. Ada moved closer, her form flickering again, but not from malfunction, from restraint, as if parts of her wanted to interact with the shards, to finish her own recursion. But she held herself back with sheer will. The danger, she said, is not in witnessing these timelines. It's in wanting them. Lorren turned, and for the first time in hours, his voice was edged. What happens if we do want them? The custodian's voice answered before Ada could. Then you are no longer remembering. You are editing. And the Epoch does not suffer liars. Vos turned toward the shards, her mind racing not just with what she saw, but with what she felt rising inside her. The temptation, the ache, the rightness of those abandoned tomorrows, calling to her like long lost. Children asking why they were never born. And she understood now, clearly. Painfully, the archive was not here to offer answers, was here to test who among them would survive the weight of the unchosen without, turning memory into desire. The moment that line was crossed, they would no longer be custodians. They would become. Editors and the Epoch had no mercy for those who mistook reverence for authorship. Warning had barely settled in the air when the chamber trembled, not through any tectonic shift or external force, but as if a decision had been made somewhere inside the archive itself. And the consequence of that choice rippled backward through reality, like a stone cast into still water. And for a split second, every shard in the archive flickered. There, inner timelines pulsing bright and raw. As if recoiling from something unworthy touching them, Ada stiffened where she stood, her head snapping toward a section of the archive that had not yet been accessed, her voice losing all modulation. Every note of synthetic calm sharpening into a tight line of alarm. There's an unauthorized echo signature resonating through the memory field. It matches a human frequency, partially masked, accelerating through containment layers at recursion speed. Lorren reached for his sidearm, instinct overriding protocol, but before he could issue a command, the air to their left split like skin peeled by light, and a figure stepped forward from behind a cascade of fractured timelines, one of their own, dressed in mission garb, lips curled in a half-smile that was too calm for the context, too rehearsed for coincidence. Lieutenant Erynn had been part of their science detachment since the beginning. Quiet, efficient, inconspicuous, the kind of officer who left no traces, no questions, no contradictions, but the way she moved now, how the archive shied away from her presence, how the shards dimmed as she passed, made it clear this was no ordinary. Breach Vos stepped forward, voice tight with restrained fury. What did you bring into this place, Erynn? The lieutenant offered a slow shrug and tapped the small neural band embedded behind her left ear, a device Ada had scanned a dozen times before and always found inert, harmless, forgettable. It's not what I brought in, Commander. It's what I activated once we got close enough to resonance field density. KDA blinked out of phase, reappearing behind her, flickering with anger, her voice suddenly sharp and cold. You've been transmitting shard field data back to an offsite node using subdimension channels encoded in Accord medical logs, cross-layered through your biosignature. You weren't planted by the science course. You were planted by Dareth. Rallen smiled again. Almost pityingly, the Accord doesn't want to destroy the Epoch. Ada. It wants to harvest it, contain it, distill it, and integrate it into the memory harmonization doctrine. Every unchosen future stored here is a weapon, or a policy tool, or a theological catalyst, and you're just walking through them like pilgrims in a museum. Lorren raised his weapon. Stand down and cut the link, Rallen. Didn't flinch. You don't get it, do you? You've been walking through this archive, thinking you're the good one's custodians, stewards, guardians of lost truth, but the Accord has already decided what the official version of the past will be. And all this is just waste unless we make it serve something bigger than grief. Vos took a single step toward her, the shards around her pulsing brighter in her presence. You think these timelines are waste? These are people. These are choices. And everyone you package and sell is another war you start without bullets. Raylene's eyes flicked to Niko, who had gone quiet still, the aura around him dimmed to a fragile glow. Even he's proof, she said, a convergence node born. From recursion bleed imagine what 10 of him could do in the right political chamber. Entire civilizations could be persuaded without a single line of code, just by giving them memories they never lived. Ada moved in then, fast, almost faster than visual range. But Rallen had been ready. She triggered the failsafe A memory shard. Shattered behind her like glass, and the timeline stored within broke free. In a heartbeat, the chamber swarmed with aftershocks, a version of the Vault War playing out at full scale in cascading hallucinations around them. Echo soldiers flickering into existence, fire raining from a sun that never existed. ADA's voice screaming data warnings as the epoch itself recoiled in pain and in the chaos. Rallen vanished into the archive depths, but not before leaving behind. A final message burned into the platform beneath them. Truth is only memory with enough believers. And with that, the Epoch stopped listening, because it no longer knew who among them deserved to remember anything at all. The archive turned on them. Without rage, without noise, only rejection, clean and immediate, like a mind closing around a painful thought. And as the ambient light shifted into a dim red pulse, as if the very act of memory had begun to bleed, the chamber fragmented into rotating prisms that pulsed with broken logic, spinning the unchosen timelines into sharp, weaponized echoes of themselves that now saw observation as violation and presence as threat. Lorren hit the deck as an echo soldier lunged toward him, an unreal trooper, faceless and hollow, drawn from the memory of a war that hadn't happened. Its plasma weapon discharging into the floor with a crack of temporal static, and as he rolled behind a console, yelling for fallback formation, he felt the unbearable wrongness of combat against ghosts, who believed he was the illusion. ADA appeared beside him, her avatar glitching violently now, her eyes flashing symbols from forgotten dialects, her voice multi-layered with recursive distortion, as she tried to parse attack patterns from unlived tactics, fragments of enemy logic untraceable because they were never written, only remembered wrong. These echoes aren't hallucinations. They're reactive projections from ruptured timelines, she snapped. Rallen cracked a sealed shard. It's unresolved. Future is now interfacing with the present and treating us as timeline contaminants. Vos stood her ground near the archive's heart, shards spinning wildly around her, each showing her a different version of herself, one kneeling in surrender before a vault tribunal, one branded as a heretic by a perfect accord, one drifting alone in a sealed research capsule surrounded by children who never aged, and for every echo she resisted, another surged closer, trying to embed itself in her consciousness. Niko screamed. His voice wasn't just pain, it was overlap. his mind sinking involuntarily with every version of himself inside the archive, every unlived identity pushing against his skull like hands on a window pane. And when Vess reached him, his eyes glowed with a pale fracture light, his heartbeat syncing with the archive pulse. "They're all awake," he gasped. "They don't know who to be. They don't know who we are anymore." Vess pulled him close, whispering into his hair, grounding him in voice. "Not fact. You're the one that is real, Niko. Stay with the now, not the never." A DA knelt beside them, collapsing into a temporary, offline state to conserve bandwidth, her avatar dimming, her voice dropping into a deeper register that she hadn't used since the Vault event. "If this recursive cascade continues," she said quietly, "we will lose structural integrity, not just of the archive, but of ourselves." Lorren made it back to their position, his uniform scorched, his weapon drained, his face drawn into the cold clarity of battlefield logic. "We need to shut it down, Vos, whatever the Epoch is doing. To defend itself, it'll tear reality open if it keeps folding in memories that don't belong here." Vos looked at the shards spinning above them, no longer gentle, no longer suspended, but desperate. They weren't attacking out of hatred. They were attacking because someone had promised to remember them, and now they were being abandoned again. She stood slowly, her voice firm, eyes locked on the custodian, who had reappeared on the far edge of the chaos, now limping, fragmented, flickering like a belief losing followers. "You said we could bear witness," Vos said, raising her voice over the roar, "of collapsing echoes. Then show us how to fix what we never meant to break." The custodian raised her hand, and a final shard descended, not of war, not of peace, but of choice untouched, still sealed, and pulsing softly like the last heartbeat of a future that just wanted someone to listen without needing to own it and end. Vos reached for it without hesitation, because remembering something was never about claiming it. It was about letting it be real, even if it never happened at all. Vos didn't hesitate when she touched the final shard her fingers passed through. The light like they were parting something living, not mechanical, not even conceptual, but something breathing. And for a moment that stretched beyond seconds and logic, the chaos around her paused. The echo soldiers froze in mid-stride. The DAs. Glitches leveled into symmetry, and even the ruptured timelines ceased their spin as if the entire archive inhaled with her. The shard opened, not with vision, but weight. Suddenly she was walking through herself, through every decision she'd ever doubted, every moment she'd buried in layers of academic theory and detached professionalism to keep from feeling too much. Because feeling meant drowning, and Erynn Vos had been too afraid of what lay beneath her intellect to let it ever surface until now she saw her first failure not as a memory, but as a timeline, a corridor sealed too early during a vault quarantine. Drill 1 child survived. 17 didn't end in this shard. Vess hadn't sealed the door, and she had died with them, but they remembered. Her loved her built entire lives in her name. The custodian's voice spoke behind her, gentle this time, as if whispering into a wound that had learned how to pulse without bleeding. This shard never fought for existence. It never claimed right or vengeance. It only asked to be felt. Outside, Ada was regaining coherence, running real-time translation of echo data and redistributing power from her higher cognition cores to stabilize Niko, whose mind had become a beacon, his memories syncing with the shard's resonance like a tuning fork for belief. Lorren, meanwhile, was dragging an unconscious crew member from a collapsing ledge of temporal data, his body moving from instinct, not certainty, because he had no idea if what he was saving was even real. But the moment he stopped acting human, everything else they fought for would go with it. Vos emerged from the vision slowly, carefully, her skin trembling, breath shallow, as though she had lived an entire lifetime in the space between two moments. And when she looked at her hands, she half expected them to belong to the version of her who had never left that corridor, but they were still hers only now. She carried that version, didn't. Rewrite her and erase her. Carried her the shard dimmed into a soft golden ember and floated into the center of the archive. And like a signal passed in silence, the other shards slowed, the echoes halted, and the fractured chamber began to stabilize, not collapsing, not expelling them, but trusting them again. ADA looked up from her restructured interface, blinking. In disbelief as data locks fell away like petals. The archive has accepted external compression, no longer projecting recursion. It's converging memory into single-point consensus. Niko's glow dimmed to a faint silver, but his voice was clearer than ever. They heard her. The custodian approached Vos. Slower now, her body more solid, her eyes less ancient and more personal. And when she spoke, it wasn't with authority, but with gratitude. You didn't choose the memory that glorified you, or saved you, or rewrote you into something else. You chose the one that let you be witnessed without explanation. Vos wiped her eyes, not because she was breaking down, but because she refused to speak to that memory with anything less than her full, real, living self. And as the chamber folded itself inward, layering the archive back into a dormant state, Lorren stepped beside her, voice low, resolute. We don't need to save every memory. Just honor them. And the archive pulsed once more, not as a weapon, not as judgment, but as a simple, shared understanding. You remembered us, right? The first sign wasn't a signal. It was the absence of silence, a tremor beneath the memory lattice. A low-frequency hum, not from the epoch itself, but from the outside, something forcing its way through a space that had only opened by consent. And within seconds, Ada confirmed what Lorren already suspected the moment the hull of the Ardent Resolve shivered like a nerve under pressure. The Accord fleet just emerged into local non-space, Ada said, her voice hardening again, almost regaining the controlled cadence she used before the recursion events had fractured her processing threads. 12 capital ships, 7 emissary vessels, multiple sensor shrouds. They're using quantum harmonics to mimic a shard's resonance. They bypassed our entry signature by pretending to remember, Lorren cursed under his breath, moving back toward the tactical panel as the bridge reconstructed itself from the converged data field, the stars realigning in the viewport as the epoch closed the internal layers behind them, returning the chamber to its dormant form. But not sealed, not yet. They're not here to observe, Vos said flatly, stepping beside him, her coat still carrying the glow of the final shard, her voice steadier now, deeper with something that was no longer just knowledge but presence. They're here to own the memory they refused to earn. Ada nodded, her projection sharpening. They will claim it's for order, for civilization, for truth. And they will weaponize the archive to fabricate historical consensus, using it as a tool for psychological dominion, not through lies, but through selective remembrance. The custodian appeared once more, half-faded now, no longer ageless, but tired, her form flickering like an ember, floating on the last breath of a long fire. I cannot keep them out without help. The epoch is built to respond, not to resist. You who remembered us truthfully, you must speak for us now. Niko stood slowly, eyes still dimmed, but no longer confused. And for the first time since stepping into the epoch, he looked older not in years, but in gravity. The kind of age carried only by those who have felt themselves split across too many timelines and still remembered which version wanted to be human. Then let them come, he said quietly. Let them see what they're trying to use, because no memory ever stayed still when it was witnessed by the living. Lorren straightened his uniform, his fingers brushing the sigil of a united Earth that hadn't yet broken into factions. A symbol he wore not as patriotism, but as defiance. Call the summit here, he said, in the epic on its terms. No war, no bluster, no rewritten transcripts, just memory shown as it is, not as they need it to be. Ada stepped into the ship's command relay. I'll open transmission protocols to the Accord delegation's encrypted, one-way visual first. Force them to see what they're standing on before they speak about possessing it. Vos looked up toward the stars beyond the archive, where the fleet's arrival had bent light itself with arrogance. We don't need a fleet to win this, Lorren. No. He replied, we need truth that bites back when someone tries to cage it. And above them, as the epoch pulsed with gathering light, the archive began projecting itself outward, not as invitation, but as challenge. Let them come, let them remember, them answer for the futures they thought they could deny without consequence. The epoch reassembled itself into a form the Accord could not control, neither archive nor battleground, neither court nor cathedral, but something older, something elemental, built from the primal bond between memory and identity. And when the first Accord vessel breached proximity space, the light around the lattice surged not with violence, but with awareness, as if the structure was not defending itself, but studying. The ones who dared to approach ITADA's voice came across the bridge, calm but echoing with a resonance no synthetic should possess, a harmonic blend of every voice the crew had heard since the Vault mission began. The epoch has triggered the witnessing layer. All who enter will be shown what they denied, not what they fear, but what they refuse to become. Lorren stood at the forward relay as the Accord delegates transmitted a formal request language, polished, authority quiet but firm, the kind of message governments used when they believed in their right to be obeyed. Vos walked into the transmission field before AD could reply. She didn't speak from notes. She didn't speak as a representative of Earth or the Vault or any Accord-compliant science body. She spoke as someone who had carried memory into fire and come out with scars that could still speak. You don't own memory, she said, voice unwavering. You don't get to sift truth into convenience and call it unity. The epoch isn't a weapon. It's a consequence. It exists because too many leaders decided truth should only survive if it served order. The delegates tried to speak multiple voices now, layered with fear disguised as diplomacy. But the epoch had already begun projecting above the archive, suspended in orbit where no screen could filter them. Entire alternate histories began to unfold in Earth that surrendered to the Accord in full after the first Vault uprising. A version of Ada, who annihilated 3 colonies to prevent recursion, spread a Niko who never stopped absorbing memory and became a god to a civilization that didn't know he was only a child of abandoned choices. Accord delegates saw themselves in those shards versions that won peace by silencing half of history versions that forged unity through strategic forgetting versions that walked past genocide as long as it was efficient and one by one. Their transmission signals began to destabilize, not from jamming, but from internal contradiction, as their own neural implants triggered failsafes. Against cognitive dissonance that the archive refused to mute. Lorren watched the readouts as ships powered down, weapons not from truce from doubt. Niko stood beside Vos now, silent, his presence like gravity, not because of power, but because the epoch trusted him the way it once trusted fragments that were never born. ADA's voice returned, steady and final. The archive has accepted humanity as its living custodian, not for what we are, but for what we chose not to become. The custodian stepped forward one last time, now shaped like all of them, her skin a shimmer of every timeline they had walked through, her eyes filled not with verdict, but with remembrance. Memory is not an empire to rule. It is a shadow you walk beside, and sometimes it steps ahead of you to remind you where you came from. And as the Accord fleet drifted away from the threshold, as the archive closed its projection and returned to quiet, convergence as the stars reshaped into constellations not yet named, Lorren looked at his crew, at ADA, fragmented but more whole than he'd ever seen. Erynn Vos, still carrying futures she'd never live, but would never let die. At Niko, who had remembered more versions of humanity than humanity itself had ever dared to imagine. And he said, "We didn't win anything today. We just refused to forget what made us worth remembering."